Welcome to the 2023 winter workshop for ECA SoCal. And I'm going to go ahead and turn over the meeting to our chairs and who will continue.
Well, hi everyone. I'm Heidi Rosofsky, and I'm one of the three co-chairs for Southern California Earthquake Country Alliance, and my other cohorts in crime are Margaret Vinci, who will be speaking later, and Alan Hanson, who is also one of the three of us who are going to be introducing people and chairing this meeting. So we're looking forward to getting started.
Hi, Alan Hanson here. So we're looking forward to having a great meeting. Have about 150 people so far, so that's fantastic. The coordinating committee. Sorry, folks, I'm trying to do this on my phone. My computer is on the blink today. In any event, the coordinating committee is shown on the screen. We have a few openings that we're looking forward to filling. And if any of you folks have a little time for a couple of meetings a year, as well as some planning or other duties, we'd love to have you. So we have 2 assistant positions, as well as a regional workshops coordinator and membership coordinator. So please let Mark or Gabby know if you're interested in joining that. And I thank you very much.
Okay, so we've got a lot of things happening in already, planned in the 2023. The first one up is the Los Angeles Abilities Expo, which is at the LA Convention Center, and we have a booth there that we're going to be, distributing a lot of information and talking to folks with disabilities about their planning. So if I know that we're still looking for some volunteers to help us. So if you want to contact Mark or Sharon or Gabby, or me to push the information along. Thanks. And then March 10th is the 90th anniversary of the 1933 earthquake, tsunami awareness course in Long Beach, which is I went and looked at the information on it. Looks very interesting, and that's right before Tsunami Preparedness Week, so it's perfect timing. And then we have our ECA spring workshop and our summer workshop, and of course the California Great Shakeout. And you can click on the link to register or go to ECA to take a look at that. And then we'll have our other workshop at the end of the year. So that's kind of what we've got coming up, but I suspect we'll be seeing more. Today's agenda, we are also going to be having some great speakers, and the first one up is going to be Lori Dengler. And Margaret, I think you're introducing her.
Yes,
Am I wrong on that?
I have the pleasure of doing that. But we have kind of been in a time frame in the last few months of having some notable earthquakes. Of course, the Turkey earthquake as well. And we do want to, the ECA, all of us would like to express our thoughts, prayers, and our sympathy for all those that have lost their lives in the Turkey earthquake, as well as those thousands of people that are now trying to recover from that event. But today what we wanted to focus in on is the Ferndale earthquake. And so we think that a lot of you here in Southern California, a lot of us are not really aware of the different types of seismicity we have in California. Of course, we are a strike slip fault here, but up in the northern part of California, it is a triple junction. Actually kind of similar to Turkey, I think, Lori. So I want to introduce Lori Dengler. And she's going to talk about the Ferndale earthquake and educate us on the subduction zone up there, threat up there and the earthquake itself. So Lori is an Emeritus Professor of Geology at Humboldt State University, where she served as chair of the Geology Department for many years. She's an expert in tsunami and earthquake hazards. She is our dear friend and partner of Earthquake Country Alliance, and she also is the creator of the Redwood Coast Tsunami Working Group. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Lori.
Thank you very much, Margaret. And I'm assuming Mark or someone, yes, will advance the slides. So I'm going to give you a kind of quick overview of what happened on December 20th, try to put it in some kind of geologic context, and emphasize some of the points that I think are really important for anyone dealing with earthquake hazards. So next slide, please. First, I want to acknowledge that my talk is really the work of many, many people. And over the past 2 years, we've started GOOSE, the Gorda Onshore Offshore Seismic Observatory. I'll talk briefly about some of what's being done at the very end, but it uses optic cables to detect earthquakes. And we have folks from many, many different institutions involved. So this is not just my work, it's the work of many. Next, please. So the basics, 2:34 a.m. Local time, a magnitude 6.4 earthquake occurred roughly where that red star is, located just off the coast, just north of Cape Mendocino, in what we call the Mendocino Triple Junction region, and I'll get into that some more a bit later. This earthquake was relatively deep, about 11 miles beneath the surface. I will be using English units throughout because I know the folks that think in kilometers understand miles as well. The fault rupture was roughly on the order of 10 miles, and you can see it sketched out by the orange band here. And this was a strike slip earthquake where the rocks to the north slipped to the west or to my left relative to the rocks on the south. So this was a left lateral strike slip earthquake. It produced very strong ground motion. We'll get into that more in a moment, but it only lasted about 8 seconds, though when you talk to people, they said it lasted forever. There was no tsunami threat, and that's important also because we're certainly very concerned about tsunamis here on the North Coast, and we've had more deaths due to tsunami over the past half century than we have due to earthquakes. So tsunami awareness is a big issue. This particular earthquake was not large enough. The rupture was mainly beneath land, and it was a strike slip fault. So just a real quick overview of the damage. 2 deaths attributed to this earthquake. The first California death since the earthquake, I think it was 2002, 2003 near Paso Robles. 17 injuries, but I'll get back to those deaths in a moment as well, because they were not due to the collapse of structures. In fact, the only way in which the earthquake may have exacerbated those deaths is through fear. That they were basically heart attacks. The medical folks were able to reach them just as quickly as they would have on any normal day. Unfortunately, they were not able to bring those 2 people through. The 17 injuries is also important because that's a really small number. Much smaller than similar sized earthquakes we've had in the past. And I'll get back to that a little later on too. On the order of 10 million in property losses. It did get a state of emergency declared by the governor, but no federal disaster. Just under 100 red tag structures, 270 yellow tag. Almost all of those were single family homes and mobile homes. 5 fires resulted from the earthquake. No problem in getting emergency facilities, fire engines to get to those areas. Next slide. So I'm going to kind of run through a couple of really important points in terms of communicating with the public, with decision makers about earthquakes. And the first point, so many people confuse the strength of shaking with the magnitude. And I'm quoting from actually an emergency manager who said it didn't feel like a 6.4, it seemed much bigger. And that's simply because magnitude is not a good proxy for how strong the shaking is. This earthquake, I think it ranks about 3rd in terms of the strongest accelerations measured in a California earthquake, just behind the 1992 Cape Mendocino earthquake, where over 2G, twice the acceleration of gravity, was recorded. And then the Tarzana site in the Northridge earthquake in 1994, which was about 1.8 G. The instrument near the Peter Street overpass on 101 recorded just under 1.5 Gs. That's enough to kind of knock you in the air. You really would have a very, very hard time standing up. And most people could not stand up, and that may have also been a good thing, as I'll get to later on. Next slide, please. So what I've shown here again is the location of the earthquake, the rupture, and of course, keep in mind that that entire 10-mile long rupture area is producing the seismic waves that we feel in an earthquake. In black are, I've selected some of the measured accelerations. Very close to the rupture, we see that maximum in Rio Del of just under 1.5. In Fortuna, just to the north of the rupture, is 0.8, which is still very, very large. And then decreasing with distance, and where I live, it was just under 0.2. Fortunately, I didn't experience it. I was in Sacramento at the time. I'm very glad I didn't experience it, because very strong earthquakes in the middle of the night are scary and traumatizing, and I didn't get traumatized by it. Plus, I was able to communicate, because I was in a hotel in Sacramento. I was able to communicate with the media, communicate with emergency officials, and had I been home, I would have had no power and I would have basically been silent. In looking at this figure, you will note a real distinct difference between those stations at the bottom at Cape Mendocino and at Petrolia, which were actually weaker than they were at my house, 0.12, and then very strong in Rio Del and Fortuna, and still very strong as we're moving to the north. Certainly many people in Eureka, Arcata, and McKinleyville, where I live, described it as the strongest or nearly the strongest earthquake that they had ever experienced. Next slide, please. So why were the ground motions so strong and so asymmetrical? Well, if it were just the source, I mean, we know that it was a patch that ruptured, there was a big stress drop, but it's not symmetrical. We're seeing a lot more shaking, as I said, in Rio Del and Fortuna compared to the shaking in Petrolia. And there's likely a number of reasons. And the first is just the typical radiation pattern that a strike-slip fault produces for S waves. And S waves, the secondary waves, are the strongest part of the earthquake faulting, the shear wave. And it's not like a bomb blast that's uniform in all directions. It's very much concentrated perpendicular, those orange lobes north and south of the fault, and along the fault zone itself. And you'll see that both Rio Del and Fortuna are in the lobes of strong shaking. And Rio Del and Petrolia is actually in one of the areas where the shaking is not so strong. I have a good friend that lives in Petrolia, and he was shocked to find out that the earthquake was as close as it was to him, because it felt very rolling, and his picture frames didn't even move and jostle in his house. So really, really different. So the orientation of the faulting is one factor. Next slide, please. Faults don't just happen instantaneously. They break. They may break in two directions, or they may break from one end and head to the other. In the case of this earthquake, the rupture began offshore, and then it proceeded to rupture onshore. And another possible effect is what we call the Doppler effect. When a train is moving towards you, you hear the sound get higher and higher and higher in frequency. Well, the same thing happens with an earthquake. When the earthquake is rupturing towards you, it compresses the seismic waves and they feel sharper. Conversely, if it is rupturing away from you, it stretches those seismic waves out. So my friend in Petrolia, again, he felt the train going away from him. So a more rolling experience. Next picture, next slide, please. Geology is important, and this is important everywhere because there's always geology and it's never uniform. This is the state geologic map of the area just north of the Triple Junction, where the Eel River, the blue part here, goes through. And the Eel River is in this very thick sediment-filled valley. It's a bend, it's a fold, it's what we call a syncline. And the youngest sediments are in yellow, slightly older are in pink. And you'll notice that Fortuna is sort of in the middle of the packet and Rio Del is at the edge. Now, we learned a lot in 1995 in the Kobe earthquake about being on the edge of a sedimentary valley. You tend to have this resonance effect where the ground shaking can be much, much stronger than it is on bedrock or even in the middle of the soft sediments. All of these things we'll be learning more about as scientists work more on this. But the point is that distance alone is not the only thing that controls how strongly the shaking feels. And where you are and where the earthquake is can make a huge difference as well. Next slide. People get so confused up here about the source of earthquakes. And a lot of people, especially those new to the area, want to know the name of the fault that produces all of our earthquakes, like the San Andreas, right? It produces all the earthquakes. Of course, we know that's not true, but it's even more complicated on the north coast because it turns out we can't see the faults from the surface. The illustration here, the little red lines, are the mapped surface faults, both onshore and offshore. And there you can see in gray, primarily, the aftershock sequence of the December 20th earthquake, which is almost perfectly perpendicular to those map faults. That trend, that east-northeast trend, is showing you the fault that ruptured on December 20th. And the problem is it was way below the stuff on the surface. Here we have to think in 3 dimensions. Next slide. This is a little cartoon illustrating our triple junction. So most of us, unless you happen to be in the greater LA area, are living on the North American plate. So if you are to the east of the San Andreas Fault, you are on the North American plate. The San Andreas Fault divides the yellow Pacific plate from the red North American plate, and you can extend this going all the way down to the Salton Sea. So the Salton Sea really marks the end of the San Andreas system, where it morphs into the much more complex spreading center in the Gulf of California. But the San Andreas ends at Cape Mendocino. And there we have this green plate, the Gorda plate, the Gorda-Juan de Fuca system that is being pulled by gravity beneath those of us living on the red plate, the North American plate. So let's go to the next slide, sort of a detail of that. All of those mapped surface faults are in the North American plate. Where these 3 plates meet, we call the Mendocino triple junction. And triple junctions tend to be places where you have a lot of stress, you have a lot of faults, and you have a lot of earthquakes. And as was mentioned at the beginning, the Turkey earthquake occurred in a triple junction area, an even more complex triple junction than the one that we have in Northern California. This earthquake and most of our North Coast earthquakes occur in the Gorda plate, in the green. They either occur offshore or they occur on the subducted part, the part of the Gorda plate that's beneath us. Next slide. This is a map that Ross Stein put together a number of years ago, showing larger earthquakes on the North Coast, doesn't include the most recent ones. And you can see lots of offshore earthquakes on sort of northeast, southwest trending faults, all left lateral. That's sort of the fabric of the Gorda plate. And that fabric has been pulled right beneath us along that subducting process. So these same faults exist buried beneath us on the land. So next slide, please. Just like faults that we can map on the surface, these faults persist in time. And we think the December 20th earthquake occurred on the same fault that produced a 5.3 earthquake back in 1975. The slide over there on the left, you can just kind of see a concentration of epicenters that I've now superimposed on the right. They're the orange ones that fall absolutely right in the same place as the 6.4. So even though we can't see the faults on the surface, they're behaving just like faults everywhere, and they are sources of repeat earthquakes. Unfortunately, we can only learn about them by earthquakes because we can't really detect them by normal geologic means. Next slide. Let me talk a little bit about aftershocks. Lots of confusion about aftershocks. This earthquake, like any moderate to large earthquake, produces aftershocks. And these are the aftershocks in the USGS catalog. About 300 detected, the overwhelming majority in the first day, and then very quickly dropping off. About 58 of these were reported felt. And again, like many aftershock sequences, the largest aftershock occurred a little while later on January 1st, 5.4, that caused some additional damage. Next slide, please. So what is an aftershock and why does it matter? It's kind of interesting because that January 1st, 5.4 was clearly not on the same fault that produced the December 20th earthquake. It's actually a right lateral earthquake at not quite perpendicular, but at an angle relative to it. So is it an aftershock at all? And here we get into semantics and people's perceptions. I call it an aftershock because it clearly was related to the stresses released in the first earthquake. And when you look at this picture, you see a lot of little white epicenters that are clearly not on the main rupture plane. In this case, about 2/3 of our aftershocks were on the main plane, but then we see this shotgun pattern at both ends. And that's quite common, that we tend to see a lot of aftershocks concentrated at the ends of the rupture. Why? Because we've had slip on the fault plane where the rupture was, and there's no slip at the ends, and Mother Nature needs to accommodate that change in stress. We also had some earthquakes much further away in this same time period that that were felt. They were as much as 40 miles, 50 miles away. And at that point, I called them earthquakes, independent earthquakes of their own. And a lot of people got very upset with me and they said, no, they're aftershocks. And I realized that for some people, an aftershock, the term aftershock seems like a safer term than a new earthquake. And the whole issue of could there be another stronger earthquake is really upsetting to people. Next slide. This, I have just copied the current aftershock forecast on the USGS website about the December 20th earthquake. And the first thing you'll note in looking at this is that there's a lot of words and it's really complicated and it involves probability. We are certainly going to get magnitude 3 aftershocks. In fact, we had one this morning and it was felt. We had a 3.2. So the 68% chance of a magnitude 3 is right on. And then you'll scroll down to the bottom and you see a 1 in 8,000 chance of a larger earthquake, a magnitude 7 or larger earthquake. And this is where people get really confused because this is about the same probability that we would have of a magnitude 7 earthquake happening even if the 6.4 hadn't happened. Because anywhere in California, there is always a background hazard of a magnitude 7 earthquake. And that's certainly true on the North Coast where we've had a lot of magnitude 7 earthquakes. So it's interesting how to sort of communicate this with the public. I was on air at 3 a.m. on this December 20th, talking to people in Southern Humboldt who managed to have portable radios and could hear the recording. And it was the first time I talked to people so soon after an earthquake. And I had to really think about what I should say. And the most important thing is to reassure people that they're okay, to breathe, to be really careful about wearing gloves and picking up debris. And I did not say at that point, I said, yes, there'll be aftershocks. I did not say that there's always a chance that we could have a magnitude 7, because that was not going to be helpful to people at that time. There was a press conference that same day where someone from the California Geological Survey did say that there was a chance of a magnitude 7. And a lot of people jumped on that and thought that was a prediction. So we have to be really careful in communicating aftershock issues. And certainly, as we've seen in Turkey, aftershocks can be quite deadly. Next slide. My shake. And I know you're going to hear more about shake alert, earthquake early warning, and quote the success, because lots of messages went out. And in fact, I got the alert in Sacramento. It's what woke me up at 2:34 in the morning. And it was useful for me because then I was able to learn a lot about the earthquake. But this map shows you the nearest communities, Garberville, Willow Creek, Hoopa, Trinidad, from all the people I've talked to, who actually got an alert before they felt the shaking. Everyone in the area where stuff fell off, where there was actual damage, the alert arrived after the S wave. And I have not talked to a single person who said that it was useful. What I heard over and over again is that it made the earthquake more frightening. Many of them hadn't heard the alert before. So here they're dealing with the shaking, and then there's their phone saying something. So there's also the issue at night when people were asleep and in bed, 99% of them, which turned out to be the perfect place for them to be, because that's why we had so few injuries. They were in bed and they couldn't move. And we all know that the more you move during the shaking, the more likely you are to be injured. Some people who were aware of Shake Alert or the My Shake app thought they were supposed to get out of their bed and go to another room where there was a desk or table and get under it. And they said, but I couldn't move. And I said, thank goodness you couldn't move. We need to be better at getting the information out that, number one, make your bedroom as safe as possible. And number two, stay in it when the ground is shaking. Next slide. So I always try to put our earthquakes in context. These are earthquakes of magnitude 5.5 and larger just since 1970. We have a lot of them. And in fact, if you calculate the energy released in earthquakes, we account for 46% of the total seismic energy released in the lower 48. Happens right here where you're looking at it. Fortunately, most of these earthquakes are offshore and have not done significant damage. Next slide. People who've lived on the North Coast a long time are well aware of our earthquake threat, but particularly in the last 5 years and a lot since the pandemic, we've had a lot of newcomers move to Humboldt County that, number one, aren't aware that we have so many earthquakes, and number two, don't really understand the importance of being self-reliant. So on the top, you can see magnitude 6 and larger earthquakes going back to 1900. We've had earthquakes are clumpy, which is always difficult for people to understand. We will have a decade or more with none, and then we might have 3 really strong ones in 15 hours, like we did in 1992. A lot of people have the perception that somehow earthquake activity has increased in the last few years. Well, we've had 2 earthquakes, both on December 20th. The plot on the bottom goes back to 1970, and it just shows the number of earthquakes per year of magnitude 3 or larger. And what you can actually see by this map is that our earthquake activity has actually been somewhat lower than what it was in the 80s, especially in 92. 92 clearly was our most active recent period. So trying to reach the newcomers is always an issue. Next slide. Benefits of having a toolbox. And here I really want to thank ECA, OES, NOAA for all the support they've given us, really going back into the 1990s to build a pretty impressive toolbox, ranging from written materials, our Living on Shaky Ground publication, which first came out in 1993. We're about to do our 6th revision this year. Last year, we were able to complete a virtual field trip of the Mendocino Triple Junction. And I know that it was painful for Mark Benthian to pull us through this, but he did. And it is a wonderful tool to try to explain to people what the Triple Junction is and why it's important. And then we've had the Redwood Coast Tsunami Work Group since 1996. I write daily columns in the newspaper. We are recognized on the North Coast as credible sources of information and a local credible source of information. Friday, I'm doing a presentation to a Latino group who will not listen to government people. They're so suspicious of government agencies, but they're perfectly happy to have us come and talk. So a sustained outreach program with consistent messaging that we always tell people we're learning on our message could change. Next slide. I mentioned that this is part of Goose, and you are now looking at something that you've probably never seen before. This is the recording of the magnitude 5.4 aftershock by the optic cable that runs from Arcata to Eureka. So going from left to right is basically north to south distance. So on the left is Arcata, on the right is Eureka, and time is going up. So earliest time is at the bottom, and all those funny angled lines are cars driving on old Arcata Road. So as the car drives, the cable is picking it up. And you can actually estimate how fast the car is going by the angle. Most of these are going about the same speed. But you can see the very abrupt mark at the bottom where the P wave, and then the darker red where the S wave arrives. And we're hoping that information from this experiment will allow a much better understanding of just what you can do with the optical recordings, optic cable recordings, and it may become part of USGS operations around the country. Stay tuned on that. Next slide. So a very quick rehash of lessons. Almost no one injured. In 2010, there were over 200 injuries in a 6.5 earthquake offshore of Eureka. 1992, there were over 400 injuries. Both of those earthquakes happened in the middle of the day. Our local medical community, very aware of planning for earthquakes. They had extra people they brought into local hospitals, and they couldn't believe that nobody came. Basically, there were no injuries. I mean, there were 17 injuries, they were all minor. The lesson from that is because people were at home, asleep, and in bed, and they weren't able to move during the earthquake shaking. So again, it's not getting under the table that's really important. The important thing is you don't move. while the ground is shaking. The 2 deaths were not related to earthquake damage, but fear may have been important. And so giving people tools to deal with the fear, we tell people, try to get into the habit of counting, just because counting allows your brain to focus on something else and remember to breathe. No tsunami threat. However, most people were not aware that there was no tsunami threat, because we need to improve access to the no tsunami threat assessment. I think it needs to go, we need to go back to having this be a text message that the tsunami warning centers send out. Our hospital and bridges did really well, even though this ground shaking was really, really strong. So current codes are apparently working well, at least for a fairly short duration earthquake. The greatest losses, of course, to homes with weak foundations, unreinforced chimneys. We don't have very many unreinforced buildings left. One large brick structure in Lolita that was damaged a year ago suffered further damage. But improving access to brace and bolt to help people retrofit older structures, and especially rentals. Right now, brace and bolt does not apply to rentals. Lots of confusion about MyShake and the earthquake early alerting system. I would say that for the people on the North Coast, I can't tell you how many people have now dropped it from their phones and blocked it because it was not helpful at night. And I've been talking with folks about maybe there's a way to sort of disable. Your phones kind of know when you're sleeping now. The idea of not alerting you when you're asleep is something to consider. More concerning to me is what happened on January 1st. That earthquake, the 5.4, was in the middle of the day. There was a MyShake alert. I had a friend who was driving in the tsunami zone when he gets the alert on his phone. His response was to step on the accelerator and drive as fast as he could to get out of the tsunami zone, which to me is a perfectly reasonable response. You don't want to pull over to the side of the road if you're in the tsunami zone and it's a Cascadia tsunami headed your way. There was no question that that earthquake it was onshore, it was too small, it could not have produced a tsunami. But the audible information that you're getting, and that's what you're getting when you're driving, doesn't include that information. And so we need to really work on, particularly for events like that have no tsunami threat, getting the tsunami threat info out earlier. So that's my quick summary, and I'm glad to answer any questions. And if you come up with more, please email me. I'm glad to respond.
Lori, could you put your email address in the chat? I'll show it again here.
Yep. I'll be glad to do that.
Lori Dengler at Humboldt.edu.
Yep.
Okay, so
we have a question? Oh, sorry. Hi.
Yep.
Is it right if we ask a question?
Please.
Can an earthquake on land but near the ocean cause a tsunami?
Yes, but a very different sort of tsunami than what you get when it's entirely offshore. Okay, there we go. The most, and we actually think that may have happened in Southern California, I think 1813 or thereabouts. There was a significant tsunami in the Santa Barbara area that may have been linked to an onshore significant earthquake. Why? Because we all know that big earthquakes cause landslides on land? Well, if they're in the vicinity of the coast, they can cause landslides, either entirely submarine or landslides, what we call subaerial, that go from the land into the ocean. In 1998, there was a magnitude 7 earthquake in Papua New Guinea. Relatively little damage from the earthquake. 15 minutes later, a tsunami surges arrived and killed over 2,300 people. That was my first post-tsunami field survey, and it still remains the most difficult one that I've ever done. The interpretation is that a large chunk of the continental shelf failed about 15 minutes after the earthquake, related to the earthquake, but not exactly at the same time. And that displaced the seawater, triggering a very narrow tsunami. It only affected about 15, 20 miles of coastline, but it was 40 feet high at the highest. And it was very impressive. And after that, we became very aware of the landslide generated tsunami threat, especially in Central and Southern California, where if you look at structures along the shelf, there's certainly ample evidence of past slides. Off of Santa Barbara and Goleta, you can actually see the scars from Google Earth. Palos Verdes, again, you can see the remains of old slides. They seem to be quite rare, but it's one of the reasons that we tell everyone, if you're on the beach and you feel an earthquake, you need to get off the beach, because we don't know if there is the potential for a very localized slide.
So how do people get warned about potential tsunamis? Because you mentioned that the gentleman in his car driving, and he didn't get the information, but someone else did via text.
No, wait a sec. Yeah,
Okay.
so at the moment, all of the Shake Alert, My Shake, and other shaking, early earthquake alert programs don't do tsunami. There's nothing about tsunami in them right now. Now we're trying to change that, but in order to do so, we have to get the USGS and NOAA to be able to agree to how to do that. Because at present, the USGS can only post a link to the tsunami centers on an earthquake webpage, and similarly, NOAA, that is responsible for our tsunami warning system. In fact, when I get off this call, I will be I'm a member of NOAA's tsunami advisory panel. I will be participating on that call. But it is definitely something. So right now, the earthquake alerts do not include tsunami. We have a very active education program on the North Coast where we teach people that the earthquake is your most important tsunami alert. I mean, yes, we have official tsunami alerts that come from Palmer, Alaska. In this case, for the Ferndale earthquake, issued 4 minutes after the earthquake. For earthquakes around the globe, typically on the order of 10 minutes after an earthquake. But that system is really much more geared towards what we call the far source, the distant tsunami, the big tsunami coming from Chile or Japan, where there's actually time to do a coordinated evacuation. The most important warning for people who live on the coast is feeling the earthquake. If earthquake early warning can get tied into that in some way, that might give you a few seconds more, but it's really problematic in that we don't really want people trying to move during the strongest shaking. But where I live, our largest tsunami threat is from a magnitude 9 earthquake on the Cascadia subduction zone. The December 20th earthquake and basically all of our historic earthquakes have had nothing to do with the subduction zone. The main subduction zone has been stone cold quiet for over 300 years.
And Lori, with that wonderful news or sobering news, we do need to move on. And thank you for your excellent information today. We're going to kind of keep in on the topic, however, with the next presentation, and I'm going to queue up Margaret here. Margaret Vinci from Caltech, you are up.
Okay, am I share? Oh, okay, you've got it. Okay, but I want to thank Lori. This was fantastic information, especially the feedback regarding Shake Alert. That is going to be very important for us. I would like to connect you with our social science department. They will be very interested in this information and the feedback from Shake Alert regarding that. So really like to connect the two of you in the near future to be able to explore that more. And of course, one of the messages, unfortunately, with Shake Alert, we only have a very small spans of space that we can and time to send a message. So that message has been determined by our social scientists to be alerting people to what the event is, which is an earthquake, and then how they should respond to that. So it is drop, cover, hold on, protect yourself now. So I think a lot of education, all of our education needs to include situation awareness. It all needs to include that drop, cover, hold on is not always something to do. If you're in a car, if you're in bed, there are other ways to respond. And so all of our education messages need to include those additional situation awareness. I also think that maybe perhaps having more testing with Shake Alert. So people become more aware of the Shake Alert message. They become more aware of the alert when it's happening. I know I've been getting the alert for years while I'm in bed. And so my brain is used to evaluating what it is first before I respond. So maybe more testing would alleviate that anxiety. So this is really, really good feedback for the Shake Alert team. So thank you very much, Lori. So Shake Alert, real fast, I just wanted to give a little overview of the performance of Shake Alert. And I think that we're all kind of familiar with what Shake Alert is. It is a system created by the USGS and its university partners to potentially alert people that shaking from an earthquake is on its way. In California, the Earthquake Early Warning System is overseen jointly with the California Office of Emergency Services, CalOES. And so it is a system where we have sensors buried in the ground that detect the earthquake when it happens. So it is not a prediction. The earthquake has started. Our instruments pick up that ground motion, send it back to the first 4 sensors that then evaluate and estimate what that earthquake is, where it is, the location of that earthquake, the magnitude of the earthquake, and the expected intensity of shaking where you are with that event. So next slide. You can go to the next slide because Lori's already covered the earthquake itself. So the performance, we've actually had about 4 earthquakes recently where Shake Alert has performed very successfully. And that has been the Santa Rosa for 4.4, the Alum Rock 5.1, the Ferndale 6.4, and the Rio Del Aftershock, which is the magnitude 5.4 earthquake. Next slide. And so just an overview of the performance. I think that Lori already mentioned that many of the people that received the alerts felt shaking before they got the alert. This is going to happen if you are very close to the epicenter of that earthquake. So it does take time for our instruments to detect that earthquake. It detected that earthquake within 7 seconds of that event. But anybody that is close to the epicenter may get the alert. They will get the alert, but they may get the alert after the shaking. And so this was true with this event. It was a 13-mile radius where people actually felt the shaking before they actually got that alert. So with that, 3 million people actually got the alert on their Android OS operating system, which is the Google. So if you have an Android phone, 3 million people got that alert. People using the MyShake app, 271,000 people received alerts. And then alerts were also sent on our SD Emergency app. That was sent to users in California. And it also went out on our WIA, which is the National Wireless Emergency Alerting System. And so you will automatically get that on your phone if you have your notifications activated. And so those went out. Some app users also got the alert in the Bay Area. So the alert would have gone out to anybody that was in the intensity level 3 of shaking. So Lori talked about the difference between magnitude and intensity of shaking. Intensity of shaking is how much shaking you actually have where you are. And so anybody in that intensity MMI region of an intensity 3 threshold would have gotten that alert. Of course, the Bay Area, it wasn't strong enough to do any damage, but they do get that alert, and that is the threshold set for that. So the initial message issued was at 7.5 seconds was the origin time. It actually estimated the earthquake at a 5.6, and then as the rupture continued, it ended up estimating it as a magnitude 6.3. The accurate for that was a 6.4 earthquake. After all of our stations then had time to respond to that event, it was then accurately described as a 6.4 event. So warning times range anywhere from 0 seconds in Fortuna, which was 13 miles away, 3.7 seconds of alerting time in Eureka, which was 23 miles away, 29 seconds at Fort Bragg, which was 81 miles away, and in Sacramento, they had 85 seconds of warning. They did have an intensity 3 of shaking in some areas. And of course, with Fortuna, it was then a magnitude 7 for that. Next slide. So earthquake early warning is for public alerting, getting it on your app. So USGS has, in collaboration with Cal OES, we have authorized people that can send the alert. And that, of course, is the Wireless Emergency Alerting System, the Google Android OS phones, and then MyShake, Quake Alert USA, or SD Emergency apps. The message that you will receive is earthquake, earthquake. Drop, cover, hold on, protect yourself now. And so alerts will be sent within that threshold. So this is for public alerting, but it's also for automated actions. And this is again where a lot of the damage may be alleviated, so that before the shaking, things could be done before that shaking and the damage is created. So next slide. So with our automated actions, we can then be able to recall elevators to the first floor to let people out. We can open up a fire station door so the trucks aren't stuck inside after that earthquake. We can slow down trains. We're doing that now with Metrolink, LA Metro, and BART, being able to slow down those trains before they derail. As the energy passes over the tracks, then it derails the trains. And so we are now slowing down trains. We can also close off water valves to eliminate flooding from that earthquake. So many things can be done with machine-to-machine automated operations. Next slide. And so this is actually just one tool in the USGS toolkit. So this is a tool that is detecting that earthquake as it is happening. And then of course we have many post-alert tools. One of those is earthquake notification. So it's also good for you to know there is a difference between earthquake early warning and earthquake notification. Many of you have had signed up for an earthquake notification back in the year 2000. You get alerts for earthquakes that have happened. So just knowing there is a difference between earthquake early warning, earthquake notification, they are two different things. And then of course, many of the other programs such as Shake Maps, Did You Feel It? Many of our other tools in that toolkit to be able to utilize and know where that earthquake happened afterwards, to be able for you to make quick response decisions. Next slide. And so what can you do to take action? We want you to be able to, first of all, be able to protect yourself by downloading one of those apps. Also to be able to look at your organization, your businesses, see how earthquake early warning can be utilized, putting it over your PA system, being able to alleviate damage, being able to turn on your generators, and being able to use that information to protect yourself. So anybody wants additional information, feel free to contact me. I'm the Southern California Regional Coordinator for Shake Alert. Cal OAS can be contacted as well as the Northern California. It would be Cal EdCom to do that next. And so we invite you to be a partner with Shake Alert. And I'm going to move right into our
Margaret,
Quake Alert.
Margaret, just a second. I just want to point out there is a typo in your email address.
Yep, see it.
So, vinci@caltech, if anybody wants to contact Margaret. And one thing I just wanted to say is it is possible that with the various ways that people get messages, that people could get a message up to, I think, 3 times. You could get the WIA and an Android and an app, and you could even have multiple apps. And so be mindful of that. Even if you think you don't have it, you might be getting an alert. And are all of those able to be turned off if you don't want? Like, can you turn off WIA? Can you turn off the Android?
Well, yeah, you can turn off notifications on your phone. That would also turn off any of your other types of alerts, such as your that come through. So if you turn off one alert, if you're gonna turn off notifications on your phone, it's gonna turn off all alerts. And that'll turn off the Amber alerts as well. So WIA comes the same as Amber alerts come. Okay, so moving on to our quake break. So one of the things we like to do is share what the activity has been over time. So this is going to go from November to January of 2023. So reminding everybody that we have about an earthquake about every 3 minutes in Southern California. And so it is earthquake country, but most of those are 1s and 2s that you never feel. On an average, we have about 30 a day. We're still getting ridge crest aftershocks. So we have about 50 a day. So we've had about 5,000 earthquakes in the last quarter. 154 of those have been quarry blasts, meaning that they weren't actually earthquakes. We do pick up all ground motion. Nuclear blast in North Korea, we're going to pick up. We did pick up the earthquake in Turkey as well. But we pick up anything that is ground motion, then our sensors determine whether it's a P wave and an S wave and whether it's an accurate earthquake. 320 were a magnitude 2 or above, 32 were a 3 and above, 3 a 4 and above, and we've had no magnitude 5s during this period with that. So notable events, we had a little swarm in Mexico, and that's actually been going on for a little bit of time. What is that going to mean? We don't really know, but we are studying that. November, we had an event in Ocotillo, California, 3.6 in Bodfish, and this is relatively normal activity for this area. This is down at the southern portion of the San Andreas Fault. It's also close to some of the other faults down there. It is a low rate seismic swarm that we've been having south of Lake Isabella, and this actually started in July. The largest event of that has been a magnitude 3.6. We had a 3.5 near Lucerne Valley, and then a 4.1 in Borrego Springs on December the 31st. There was actually 1,500 people responded to our Did You Feel It? That they actually felt it in San Diego and Riverside with that magnitude 4.1 event. January 25th, we had a 4.2 event in Malibu. Many of you might remember that one, being wakened up early in the morning. That event was actually offshore. With that, and so with that event, that actually has been our most notable event of this year already. It was first at 2 a.m. Then we had an aftershock, a 3.5 aftershock that followed 3 minutes later, and then another aftershock of 2.8, and then a 2.6. This was at the depth of 9 miles deep, which is kind of getting to be relatively shallow, which is why it was felt within a wide area. With that, and was felt far north as Oxnard, as well as far south as Long Beach. Many people here in Pasadena felt it. I did not, but I did get the and I didn't get the alert for that because it wasn't triggered at the threshold. USGS did trigger an alert delivered on cell phones and approved apps. 62,000 alerts were sent by MyShake to residents of the Southern California area within that intensity level 3 of shaking. And then again to drop cover and hold on. Again, they were in bed, so we don't want them to get out of bed, to remind them to stay in bed and wait for the shaking to stop, and then to put on their protective clothing before they get out of bed, which they should be keeping under the bed. LA Fire Department did activate their citywide assessment. So they did do an assessment with that event, and there was no injuries or no damage. So this actually has been is a historical site since 1932, since we've been recording earthquakes. 4 events have happened in this area. The largest event was a magnitude 5.2. It was in 1972, and the last event was a 5.1 in 1989. There, on average, we have about 25 earthquakes between a magnitude 4 and 5 occur in California in the last year. And so this is where you can go to get additional information regarding earthquakes. And so you can go to that location to be able to get that information. And that's it.
Thank you, Margaret. You always bring us such great information, and how beautifully it ties into the agenda today. And we're going to move on to our next presenter, who is Mark Legg, and he's the president of Legg Geophysical. He has over 30 years of experience and is a recognized leading expert on faulting and seismotectonics, which we heard a little bit about in the first one, off the Southern California offshore region in particular. He has mapped the major active and ancient fault systems of the area offshore Southern California and northern Baja California, and he will now be talking to us about the complex faulting issues that face Southern California. Thank you very much, and I give you now Mark Legg.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be here and talk about one of my favorite things, a very exciting area to do research. And as Charlie Hollister, who was at Woods Hole for many years, actually he's a Hollister of Hollister Ranch, but he told me on a cruise in 1998 when we were doing island dives at San Clemente Island, the California continental borderland is an organized train wreck. And that's a really good description. And here's a train wreck just to show you. You've got the translation where things move horizontally and the cars move around. You also have these vertical axis rotations where cars are turned, as you can see some of those box cars. Things get stretched and pulled apart, the cars are lost, moved away from the locomotive. And you also get contraction or squeezing where the cars collide together. All of that is happening offshore Southern California. Next slide. And this is what we call seismotectonics, which is it's tying the seismology, the earthquakes, with the tectonic, which is the movement of the plates of the Pacific plate offshore and the North American plate onshore. And as we heard before, the San Andreas fault, or the SAF, cuts through the Mojave. That's considered the main plate boundary, but the actual plate boundary between Pacific and North America, as you can see, is over almost 200 miles wide. It goes all the way from inside the Mojave Desert, even into the Nevada Basin Range, and all the way out to the Patton Escarpment, which was the former subduction zone prior to 20 million years ago. And this shows a lot of the faults in there. And the main thing here, these little beach ball diagrams show what we call a focal mechanism. And that's the direction that the fault moves during an earthquake. And the red ones are thrust or reverse. And those are ones where you're pushing things together and things are thrust up, or they can thrust up with a horizontal component as well, which we call oblique reverse. And you see most of those are in the north, especially, in the transverse ranges, they're the Santa Barbara Channel, and just south of there along, the northern edge of Los Angeles. And that's where you have this complication where the Baja California and the borderland, part of North America, they've been, west of the San Andreas Fault, they are now part of the Pacific plate, but because they're colliding into that transverse ranges region and that big bend in the San Andreas Fault, things are kind of stuck, and so things are being squeezed together and pushed up. Now the black beach balls are the striped slip, and the dark, the colored side is the direction the fault moves, like it's towards you, or towards the seismograph station that recorded it, and the light, would be away from you. And so you can see, for those along, say, the San Clemente Fault, which is the SCF sort of in the middle, that's the main offshore fault, which is very long. It's the San Andreas of the offshore. You can see it's mostly moving the right lateral, where you have the Pacific plate on the left side of the fault, moving towards Alaska, the northwest, and of course the North American side is moving south with Baja California. The two blue ones, they're also strike slip. It's just that those are moment tensors, which is slightly more detailed measure of the earthquake than just a simple focal mechanism. Now on this, there's a pack NOAM. You can sort of see there near the San Clemente Island and the fault in the middle. And that is the small circle for the rotation of the Pacific plate relative to North America. And you can see that goes right through San Clemente Island, and the San Clemente Fault actually is seeing the plate boundary motion between the North American plate and Pacific. The other things on here are significant. You have some numbers like the 30 kilometers there near Ferrelo on the left, and you can see there at San Clemente, you've got a 60 kilometers where the EK, which is Emery Knoll, it's a caldera that's about 15 million years old. It's been offset 60 kilometers. And you can see there in the San Diego Trough SDT off of San Diego, 30 kilometers. So we've got, these faults have major slip. And, you know, like the San Andreas and the Elsinore and the San Jacinto onshore, borderland faults are active, and some of them have significant slip rates, and they've moved quite a bit. But you can also see there's faults that sort of go different directions. And that's where you get these collisions, and you can have things pushed up or drop down. And of course, that can create tsunamis. So we move on to the next slide. And this is just a detail showing the San Clemente Island fault, the San Clemente fault near the island. And you can see the fault, that beautiful, I don't know if my thing is working, but you can see there's a fault going from the lower right corner all the way to the upper left corner. And you can see there's a ridge and there's a bunch of gullies which are all offset, just like the Carrizo Plain on the San Andreas Fault. And then there's a slight bend where you don't have things pushed up, but you have a sharp drop off of the cliff, which we call faceted spurs. You see these in the basin and range where you have the extension, the normal faulting. But because you have those along this fault where a slight bend is, that shows us that yes, the San Clemente Fault is a right lateral strike slip fault with the block on the northeast side moving, you know, with North America to the south relative to the Pacific plate moving towards the northwest. And there's two different sets of locations for this December 26, 1951 earthquake, because in 1973 we didn't have the digital seismograms and they didn't have the more complex seismic velocity model necessary to locate earthquakes. And it was interesting though that that main shock shifted to the other side of the fault. But what's even more interesting, and again, this gets to our whole complex train wreck, that fault, the movement in that earthquake was left lateral on the direction of the San Clemente Fault. In other words, that black area on the top, that said that North America went to the northwest instead of south. So this is an unsolved mystery, but it could be related to this whole collision in this zone. It's like we say, a complex train wreck. And I've been trying to think about this since my thesis days, more than 30 years, and we still don't really know why. But this is the real world. It's complicated. So next slide. This is to show a little more detail on the major faults. And we have in red, you know, the major faults, and they're mostly strike slip. And these are the ones that come to the surface or near the surface. And of course, under the ocean, they come to the seafloor because they don't cut through the water. On the other hand, we also have these black with these little hash marks, like little combs. Those are the low angle. Instead of being steep and vertical, they have dips. You know, that's where the fault surface is actually at a lower angle to the ground surface. And these are detachment faults that were formed during the period when we changed from subduction to strike slip. There was a period there where the transverse ranges, which you can see with the north end of that map, the Santa Barbara Channel, that was once along the coast of Southern California, but it rifted away. It was pulled apart away from the boundary and rotated clockwise into a position it is now, which has now created this tremendous traffic jam. So those detachment faults are still there. And what I think the most important thing about those detachment faults, not only can they be reactivated as blind thrust faults, such as the people at Harvard have been studying, but also they can link these other strike slip faults into large complex earthquakes. And that's something that in the earthquakes in the last 30 years, we're learning a lot more about large, complex, multi-fault earthquakes and how dangerous they can be. So these you can see are there on the inner part of the borderland, close to the coast, and being close to the coast, in fact, going under the coast, that means there's serious hazard there to coastal communities that really needs to be better understood. So we'll go to the next slide, and you'll see a place called Navy Fan, which is offshore. The Navy does all this bombing and testing at San Clemente Island, and south of there, there's a submarine fan, which is where all these turbidity currents from the submarine canyons, they flow all the way across the inner borderland and dump into this outer basin. And Peter Lonsdale found this scarp there, and he found what he thought were hydrothermal vents. They turn out to be cold seeps, but you have vents where you have methane and other minerals and things coming out, and there's communities of clams and barite deposits and tube worms and all sorts of interesting things. So we went there with Oregon State to study the seeps and look at the scarp in more detail. And on the upper left is a very high resolution seismic profile, which sort of goes obliquely, that light blue, cyan colored arc, where we cross that at an angle so we could actually see the uplifted part. You see layers there under the seafloor. The seafloor is essentially the top of the dark area. You can see layers of sediments representing different time intervals uplifted in the scarp from the fault, and then the darker superfan turbidites. Those are the more sand rich from these big currents when you have a major turbidity current of sediment, laden water going all the way across into the outer part of the borderland. The lower profile is a deeper penetration seismic. You can see on the right side of the San Clemente fault zone, those layers of sediments below the seafloor were all deposited horizontally, but they've been progressively uplifted due to continued movement on the San Clemente fault. And you can see on the left side, there's other faults that are buried and some come near the surface, and you've got tilted blocks. And this is typical of borderland faulting. You've got this complex of strike slip and oblique slip, normal and reverse, where you have thrusting as well. But when we did the dive, you can see it says dive triflexural plunge pool. And the plunge pool is like a waterfall on land, and it goes over, it makes a pool at the bottom where it erodes the rock. Well, this is a plunge pool created by these turbidity currents, this sediment-laden water coming down, rushing down, and then overtopping this ridge pushed up by the fault and making that pool. So the next slide shows what we saw from Alvin. You have the next slide? And on the left, you see it's a vertical cliff. You're looking straight ahead, 20 centimeters. They have two laser beams on Alvin, so you can measure the distance. There's a pile of rubble at the bottom. You can see the scarp itself, and sort of the middle, there's those brittle stars. You can see sort of horizontal lines. Those are lineations which show the direction of the movement. It's almost horizontal. There's places where it looks like it's about 15 degrees off of horizontal. So that's the uplift part that pushed up the ridge, but it's mostly strike slip. And then the bottom photo is the scarp. Again, you can see the actual fault scarp with those lines, those lineaments they call slicken sides. And that's at the corner of the plunge pool. So in the plunge pool, where it's eroded, you can see a layer of clams, all those little clams sticking out of the side, sort of the middle. Those are from a seep that's probably thousands of years old. And on the dive, we saw lots of those. So this, this is recording earthquakes over thousands or maybe even tens or hundreds of thousands of years. So we'll move on to seismicity. So we'll go to the next slide to get more information about how these faults are moving. And the yellow numbers show some of the large historic earthquakes. And we heard about an 1812 earthquake. And there were two large 1812 earthquakes in December. The December 8th was there in the San Andreas, the Mojave. And we know that because they found trees at Wrightwood, which actually had trees, their tops snapped off, and the tree rings showed that. So they know that's where the December 8th earthquake was. But in December 21st, the larger earthquake was in Santa Barbara Channel region. We don't know the exact location, but there was a tsunami. And the tsunami has been controversial because they said a boat was washed a mile up Gaviota Canyon, which was 50 feet above sea level. And there was a tsunami also recorded, it was recorded at the Mission in Ventura, and that was about 15 feet above sea level. And so people said that, they said, no, that 50 feet above sea level, we don't believe that. Well, based on actual tsunami work and more modeling and stuff, and what we'll see later in the talk, that is probably a credible account because you have a steep cliff coastline and a narrow canyon. All that water piles up and then it funnels up that canyon and goes much higher. And Costas and Lacus and others saw in the Okashiro Island tsunami in Japan, where the tsunami was only 2 to 4 meters, so we're talking about 10 to 15 feet, but there was a narrow canyon where they know the water went up to 100 feet, 30 meters, because there was a telephone line with seaweed hanging from it. So this is what can happen, and that account for the 1812 tsunami probably is accurate. Another account from the native, one of the natives from the island said they saw the water recede into a very large wall, and then it came rushing inland. And, you know, before we had television pictures from Sumatra where you actually saw the water receding in a big wall, people weren't sure if that was accurate enough. But now we know with a lot of tsunamis in the last few decades, that's an accurate account. So we do have tsunamis from local sources in Southern California. Now, the other thing is you can see these are only magnitude 4 and above, and you've got quite a few, especially along the San Clemente Fault, but also, of course, in the Los Angeles Basin area and the transverse ranges, such as the Northridge earthquake is on there. And if we go to the next slide, we'll take it down to magnitude 2 earthquakes, so you can really get a better idea. And now the black dots are post-1981 earthquakes, and that's when digital seismographs were developed, so you can do much more accurate locations. And then as we develop newer models, you can get even more precise and you can compare them. And you can see the faults very well defined. With the San Andreas, you've got the Imperial Fault there and the Salton Trough sort of in the upper right, and then the San Jacinto and Elsinore. And offshore, though, you can see the San Clemente Fault is very well defined by a lot of earthquake activity that goes all the way down past, you know, the border, past Ensenada there, and all the way down to the bottom of the map, which is just about to the San Viscano Bay. So the San Clemente Fault is very long and it's capable of very large earthquakes. But there's a bunch of other faults there too, which are long. And then in the middle, just to the right of the San Clemente label, you have that really dense cluster, which is the 1986 offshore oceanside earthquake, which had a reverse slip. In other words, it had a thrusting motion for the main shock, yet a lot of those aftershocks that were lasted for 10 years had strike slip. So again, this is this complex train wreck. So the next slide shows a vertical cross section. So, okay, we've got these low angle faults, and we've got what we think are vertical or very steep. And the upper one goes from essentially the area off of, there you can, it's there at Dana Point, and it goes offshore, and you can see there's the 30 MB, that's the 30-mile bank detachment fault, that sort of angled line, but you can see the vertical lines are the main strike slip faults, which are thought to be mostly vertical. We don't have as accurate depth control for offshore earthquakes because they're farther offshore, but it's getting better as we get more stations and better velocity miles. But you can see that you have vertical strike slip faults, but there's definitely evidence of these subhorizontal, these maybe 30 to 45 degree dipping faults actually having activity as well. And the bottom one, that dense cluster, is that 1986 oceanside sequence, which is the seismicity was over a 10 to 20 kilometer wide zone. And even more significantly, there seem to be earthquakes in the upper mantle. And that shows you that the borderland, even though it's thinner crust, there's special conditions that allow earthquakes to actually get into the mantle. And that's something for further research. And over there, the SCL, the San Clemente Fault, is pretty much vertical. But again, it's important to remember these are fault zones. They're not planes, you know, a planar surface in a homogeneous half space, but these are zones of faulting which can be very complex. So the next slide will show, and this is for Lori and the Ferndale earthquake I heard about, and that was a blind strike slip earthquake. And several years ago with my colleagues, Mark Kammerling and Dan Francis, we did a paper and we noticed that where these faults seem to end at the transverse ranges, where the San Clemente Fault seems to continue possibly underneath the Santa Barbara Channel as a blind strike slip fault, and it shows up in what's the magnetic anomaly field there on the left. Also the bathymetry, you see that little Santa Barbara Basin seems to be terminated at the edge of that. And the seismicity also seems to show this. So we have this possibility that where the borderland is being thrust beneath the Santa Barbara Channel, there may be blind strike slip faults there that can have earthquakes like Ferndale, which no one has really considered before. So the next slide. Next slide. Yeah, we'll go into frequency magnitude. Next slide. We really want to know how frequent we need to have large earthquakes, but unfortunately offshore, our earthquake catalogs are not complete. In other words, farther offshore, a lot of earthquakes don't get located at all, especially smaller magnitudes, and we don't, you know, it's not a complete catalog, and we want to have as long of a record as we can. We've got, you know, the 90th anniversary of the Southern California Seismograph Network. And so what we do is what's called an extreme value analysis, where you take extreme values, that is the largest earthquake of each year, and you plot that for each year. And you can see the top curve or the top, you know, histogram. And you can see there's a number of magnitude 5 to 6 earthquakes. And this is just for the San Clemente San Isidro Fault, that main one, for a 20-kilometer wide swath along that. So this doesn't include like the Long Beach earthquake and others, but you can see there's, a number of larger earthquakes. Still haven't had any magnitude 7s, except for the one in 1927, which was off of Lompoc, which is north of the transverse ranges. And then you do this analysis, logarithmic, to get the average rates, and you can see that what type of magnitude you use is very important. We really would like to use what's called the moment magnitude, which gives a more accurate estimate of the actual energy release in the earthquake. Whereas the local magnitude, the original Richter magnitude, was based on the amplitude on a specific type of seismogram, Wood Anderson here at the Caltech in the network. But unfortunately, it's a higher frequency instrument. So at around magnitude 5.5, you can see the green curve, it drops off. And so that's what we say, it's saturated. So it doesn't really give you the accurate magnitude for large earthquakes. Whereas the other, surface wave, usually it's a 20-second. That gives you a more accurate, and then what's called the extreme value, and that's we recognize. See, in 1948, the smallest earthquake, that's only a 2.8. So we said, well, to do this analysis more accurately, we'll say that's our minimum magnitude of detection, and that's the blue curves. But the dashed line is a linear fit to that. And we can see, it's like a magnitude 6 is a 100-year earthquake for the region, and magnitude 7 would be the 475-year, 10% 50. And the 2475-year, the 2% chance is like a magnitude 7.9. And the San Clemente Fault could sustain a 7.9. It's just as big as the San Andreas. And there's other areas where you could have large earthquakes. So that's sort of a ballpark. The point is we can get large earthquakes offshore. We haven't had any 7s in Southern California since we've had recordings, but they can happen. And the next slides, we'll get into that in more detail. So we're going to look at a model of a large, complex, multi-fault earthquake on the coast. And the inspiration for this, they had the Kaikoura earthquake in New Zealand, where you had a number of high angle strike slip faults, the red lines in that low block, above a subduction zone, which is the grid. And the subduction thrust moved and triggered all those, I think in all there were like 20 or 25 strike slip faults, all moved, but they were pushed up. And I said, whoa, if I flip that map over, it looks very much like the Newport Inglewood Rose Canyon fault zone from San Diego to Los Angeles. Could you imagine the effects of a magnitude 7-point earthquake right along the coast from San Diego to Los Angeles? That would be horrifying. That would do damage and going right through the port facilities in both San Diego, the Navy and stuff. So we wanted to consider this as a possible earthquake. Now I've got more beach balls on it. They're all black, but you can see again, the north, you've got those where it's sort of in the middle. Those are the thrust, reverse earthquakes. And then of course you have the strike slips, which look like they're more evenly seen. But you do have both thrust and strike slip earthquakes throughout the region. So a complex earthquake like this looks possible. Next slide. I'll show some of the results from our analysis. So this was a model we did recently for a major utility. We took, and it's only a 7.63. We didn't do a 7.8 because we know there was the Long Beach earthquake in 1933 and possibly, on the San Joaquin Hills, the 1769 Portola, event that was felt by the Portola expedition. So, and we also stopped it a little north of San Diego. But this is multiple faults, and you can see on the upper left, you've got the seismicity plotted over what our model is, and the red and blue shows where it goes up and down, and the scale for that is in the upper right figure. So the red are things that go up, and the blue are things that go down. Now, is this a realistic model? Well, Chris Swerling and his students at Missouri, and they did a very detailed mapping of the deeper structure of the faulting and the sediments filling the basins offshore. And this is the bottom right shows the sediment thickness, and the one on the left is the top. It's from 2 million to 600,000 year old period. And you can see it's all the reds and yellows, very, very thin sediment. And it's the same on both sides of that Carlsbad and San Mateo fault. Whereas on the right, that's from 600,000 to present. And you see this very thick sediments on the offshore side of the San Mateo Carlsbad fault, where the sediment's still very thin. And that means either the eastern side came up or the western side went down, or both. And that fits, as you can see, the same color scheme in the figure above it. Our model fits that deformation very nicely. So we're confident this is probably a reasonable model. Now the smoke, go back please, real quick. Very important. The bottom left is the smoking gun. And on the leftmost, the black and white, that's a road cut or a hillside cut at Encina's Creek near Carlsbad. And there are those sort of horizontal surfaces are lateral spread surfaces where you have liquefaction, and the ground on the slope above, the sand comes up liquefied, but it reaches a more common layer, so everything above it slides over. There are at least 12 of these liquefaction lateral spread surfaces in that cut. And each of those truncate the actual sand dikes where the sand was being squirted up from the strong shaking. And then the other picture, the burial site, which is about 7,500 years old, that has been disrupted by all this liquefaction. So that shows that, one, there's been about a dozen of these in the time period for this terrace, which is about 120,000 years. And the last one was in the last 7,500 years. So we got about a 10,000 year recurrence interval for these very large earthquakes that we're modeling. Next slide. So this gets to the tsunami hazards because that can create a tsunami. This is from modeling of a Pacific Rim. This is the Eastern Aleutian Alaskan, which is recognized as the most severe subduction zone source for tsunamis in Southern California. Think Alaska earthquake of 1964. But this is based on a magnitude 9.5 on that, where we modeled all the slip, the greatest slip at the trench where you would get the most seafloor uplift. And you can see these are 3 snapshots of what the actual height of the water level was, the amplitude of the wave above sea level for the incoming wave. They're right on the coast, and the top right is a larger region. And people talk often about the borderland because of these ridges and basins. There you have the Channel Islands and Santa Barbara Island, and San Nicolas Island and Catalina. And so you can see that they think sort of blocks the tsunamis, and then they reflect it back. But actually, they also trap they trap the tsunami energy in the coast. They also redirect it because shallow water, shallow water acts as a wave guide. It focuses like antennas, they use for GPS and stuff. It's a wave guide for tsunamis, and you can see how it directs the energy to different places. So there along the Southern California coast, you get areas where it's much higher amplitude than others. And then the bottom one is a more detailed. And the Badaquitos Lagoon is there along the coast near Carlsbad, halfway between La Jolla and Newport. And we'll talk, but before I get to that, the other very important thing is you can see the animation we did, the actual waveform for a gauge just offshore of San Onofre has multiple waves. And this is this reflecting back and forth of the energy. And this is very important for first responders. If there's a big earthquake and a tsunami, they need to know, is the second wave or the third wave or others bigger? And this happened in the Alaska earthquake in Eureka, when people went down the docks after the first wave because it wasn't very big, and then the second and third waves are much bigger, and a lot of people died because they didn't realize that. Okay, so we'll go to the next slide, and this is just sort of a summary of the things. But first of all, there's this tsunami loads and effects. This is ASCE, the American Society of Civil Engineers. They have a tsunami inundation geodatabase which goes to help planning, for construction in tsunami zones. And you can actually go to their geodatabase and pick your place and make little transects, and it will give you what the run-up is. Now, this is the elevation, the maximum elevation the water reaches at a given point along the transect. So I did 3 transects at that Badaquitos Lagoon. And in that area with the sort of dashed red lines, that's the area where Jerry Kuhn there on the bottom found this tsunami deposit. And Lori has seen this, and Costa says it looks just like Papua New Guinea. And the importance is, first of all, this is 25 to 29 feet above sea level in that part of Badaquitos Lagoon. And that's consistent with the data from this modeling done by all these tsunami modelers for the ASCE 7-16. Furthermore, you can see farther up there, it even got up to 40 feet in the red transect there. And so you see this is this wave surging in there. So that's very important. And I guess we'll finish with this, that we also have considered submarine landslides, and we did one for a magnitude 6.9 scenario for San Diego, a Rose Canyon earthquake. And this is a landslide of the submarine canyon there, Coronado Canyon, just south of the border, which is very steep canyon, and there does appear to be landslide material. And then the snapshot is the wave coming in. You can see you get the amplification of the energy there in the narrows between Shelter Island, the SI, and North Island, in Coronado. And the wave, a colleague was saying, yeah, he was in Coronado when the Alaska tsunami came in. He says, I was trying to catch the ferry, but they said the ferry's delayed because there's a 5-foot wave going through San Diego Bay. And this is a similar thing for the modeled Coronado Canyon submarine landslide. So it's very complex offshore because it's had a long history with a deformation from subduction to extension to strike slip. And all those faults are complicated. And because it's trying to move towards Alaska, but it's blocked by the transverse ranges in the Bend and San Andreas, you still have very complex deformation. The largest historic earthquakes have been in the western transverse ranges since 1812, and just west of there, the 1927 Lompoc earthquake, which did generate a local tsunami. Seafloor observations, we found prehistoric earthquake fault scarps that were consistent with magnitude 7 earthquakes on the San Clemente Fault. Moderate earthquakes occur throughout the borderland, and we get 2 to 3 per decade, maybe more. Large, complex, multi-fault earthquakes have long recurrence intervals for 1,000 years, maybe 10,000 years, but they're still unpredictable. So we have a severe threat from these because they're along the coast. And the coast is more susceptible than anywhere else, obviously. And so we modeled it, and paleo liquefaction, these tsunami deposits, and there's ground cracking and other features, all representative of very strong shaking along the North San Diego County coast. And we're pretty confident these kind of deposits, where they haven't been developed in greater way, can probably be found, throughout California, not just Southern California. And our local, models show that what the risk is to the coast. And there's a lot of that work done with Costas and Sinolakis and the group at USC Tsunami Research Center. And the distant Pacific rims, those very large ones we know about, and if they have very strong currents, have been the main hazard. There hasn't been as much from inundation, except farther north. But in Southern California, the currents in the harbors have been the most severe. So we do have severe risk, mainly from the inner borderland and Santa Barbara Channel because they're closer to shore. The outer borderland faults are there, and if they have a tsunami, then that can create additional problems. But I think the most important need we have is we need to get slip rates for offshore faults to actually come with a more realistic assessment of the risk. So I think that should be all for now. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that great presentation. Gabby,
Heidi, I have a comment I'd like to add, and also Mark, thank you so much for summarizing so much research that's been done in a very, you mentioned that the zones themselves are complex, but obviously researching things that are underwater, you can't just walk along, also very, very complex. I wanted to emphasize our guidance, and this really shows why it's important that if you are near the shore and you feel an earthquake, it could be an onshore earthquake further inland, but it could be off the coast. And as Mark has shown, it could have generated a tsunami. There won't likely be time for an alert, a tsunami alert to warn you to, where you receive it. So the shaking itself is your warning. You want to, if it's strong shaking and you can't move, you want to drop, cover, hold on, and protect yourself as normal. But then as soon as you're able to move inland into high ground, and this is something that's important, of course, for people who live or work right along the coast, but really everybody in Southern California, because you may one day travel, go to the beach or be there. So we are behind, and if further questions put into the chat. Thank you again, Mark. And I just want to mention again, the presentations and the recording of today's workshop will be on the same page where you registered. There is a link to that in the chat, hopefully by early next week, so you'll be able to get everything and share this if you'd like to with others, like the whole recording. And also we do have a survey, the link there in the chat. Please do take that before you leave us today. You can start that now even. I'm going to run through a couple updates on our resources and ways you can participate. And I'm going to turn my camera on too. How about that? Thank you again, Mark.
Thank you.
And okay, so as a reminder, Earthquake Country Alliance is statewide, and we welcome people. I know there are people here from Northern California for the SoCal workshop, and we like to see that happening. Probably were very interested in the topics today. We do have regional alliances that organize events like today. The next SoCal workshop will be on May 10th, maybe in person. We get our support from Cal OES, which in turn is funded by FEMA through the National Earthquake Hazards Reduction Program, and ECA is headquartered at USC. And we do really encourage, if you aren't already a member, if you didn't get the email directly about this workshop, if it was forwarded on to you, do go ahead and join us at earthquakecountry.org/join. We coordinate websites. We support Tsunami Preparedness Week. We created and manage Shakeout, and you can find all of these and other events on the website, including other activities coming up on the calendar, earthquakecountry.org/calendar. Of course, coming up at the end of March is California Tsunami Preparedness Week. There are activities coordinated locally across the state. The state is also working with its local partners on how they will respond when there actually is an earthquake and tsunami. And there is a course that if you're interested in really learning more, especially if you're a government agency or others who are really managing your programs or public outreach, ARW-217. It's a course that's been certified by FEMA from the International Tsunami Information Center, and it's being offered in Long Beach. You can find out and register for that at earthquakecountry.org/calendar has a link to it. Just like with Shakeout, we ask that you register your tsunami activities either during Tsunami Preparedness Week or year round, and you can find out and do so at tsunamizone.org. We do list a number of different types of activities that are eligible for counting towards your registration. There's not one simple thing as much as practicing how you protect yourself during an earthquake that everybody can generally do. Not everyone's going to do a tsunami walk because not everybody lives right near the coast. But if you do, we really do encourage you to, with your neighbors, get together and practice how, when an earthquake occurs, how you would get to your tsunami safe area outside of the inundation zone. So that starts with knowing your zone. You come through the website, you can find out there are really great new maps in the California Geological Survey all along the coast for where tsunami, the highest or furthest inland tsunamis are anticipated to go. But you can see there are a lot of ways that you can participate, and we do have guides for organizing your own tsunami walk. Okay, of course, our information is organized across all our materials with the 7 steps to earthquake safety. Please do share that, and the links here, earthquakecountry.org/7steps, and in Spanish, terremotos.org/siete pasos. With anyone who is asking, how do I, improve my safety for earthquakes, tsunamis? We have this information in 16 languages now. These are all these documents available for you to download and distribute or refer people. In fact, we have a page for each language. So earthquakecountry.org/Korean or /Tagalog or the various languages that you'll find links to from this page, earthquakecountry.org/languages. These links are being put into the chat. Thank you very much, Gabby. And then I want to highlight a new guide that we have that puts together simple guidance for how to secure some of the most common items in your house or workplace. We're talking about, shelving or file cabinets, your televisions, small items, cabinets, refrigerators, and appliances. And this is all together in one document you can download, and has a worksheet too that you can use to plan. And this, again, also in multiple languages. So this is, the number one cause of injuries during earthquakes are all the things falling and flying around, broken glass and such. So this is really important that you do this work, and why we emphasize it so much. And we will be having some online trainings and maybe some in-person trainings on how to do this, as we've been doing for the last few years. All our activities, just saw the note in the chat, just go to earthquakecountry.org/calendar. And that's where you'll find the link to the tsunami course as well. You can participate with us in many ways, and it's a really great way to become a leader in this area and to work with us. We're looking for subject matter experts within these committee, these sectors to work with us on developing the content, webinars, and other resources. So if you're interested and you belong to one of these groups, join us. You can find out more earthquakecountry.org/committees. We also have outreach bureaus, and I'll highlight that if you would like to have a presentation or a booth at your event, you go to earthquakecountry.org/events, and that's where you can fill out a short form to get us the information we need to figure out if we can come. In order to highlight our accessibility committee, and again, as mentioned earlier, the Abilities Expo coming up March 10th to the 12th at the LA Convention Center. We are looking for all of you who would like to really learn more about the proper messaging in this area, and to have conversations with people, and to really, this is the best outreach activity we do all year in terms of the real valuable conversations we're having from people who are really deal with so much everyday situations, that the aspect of having something like an earthquake that will disrupt the physical environment, and which can cause additional issues for people who perhaps may use a wheelchair or a walker, or who, if the bookshelf falls over and blocks their path, they may not be able to exit. So all these are messaging on for the 7 steps, just that much more important for people with disabilities or other access and functional needs, which I'll remind everybody that could be you any moment. If you break your leg or something else happens where you're not as mobile as you're familiar with being, you may have to adapt your situation, just like we showed here from the drop, cover, hold on messaging to, if you use a walker or wheelchair and it has wheels that you can lock or turn off the power for, when to do that, lock, cover, and hold on. And we have all the guidance for that at step 5 as shown here, earthquakecountry.org/step 5, including what to do if you're in a car or near the beach, as I mentioned, and all sorts of different situations.
Before you go on, Mark, I really recommend that anyone go who doesn't have a lot of background with people with disabilities, because you really understand more about the abilities that people have, and how best to understand, so we can create messaging that's acceptable and useful. Thank you. Go ahead.
Thank you, Heidi. And I also want to mention, if you're interested in joining us for one or all of the days that we'll be there on, again, it's coming up in a couple of weeks, Friday to Sunday, March 10th to the 12th. Please do email us at info@earthquakecountry.org. And we just love to have you there. We're building a great team, and you can be a part of it. I wanted to mention, if you've applied for this year's mini awards, or maybe some of you here, we are in the final stage of getting approval for those that they've all been, the applications have been reviewed. And so you should be hearing within the next week about the status of your award. We may be having another application period coming up in a couple months. So be thinking about projects that you can propose. You will document your through a simple form what your project is, how you evaluate it, who the project will benefit, and this is either doing a mitigation project like securing contents within a school or a workplace or homes or independent living centers or those places. You propose the project, we buy the materials for you and deliver them to you, and then you implement the project. And also can be education activities. So you can learn more at earthquakecountry.org/mini awards. And that's the update. And really, are there any questions on the latest part here? I don't see any. We can open the floor to general questions.
And if you have any kind of a short announcement or something that you learned or open discussion, anything like that, we don't have a lot of time, but please be sure and let it and speak up, because we really want to hear from you.
You can raise your hand if you know how to do that through the Zoom tool, or you can, I'll just give a moment if anybody would like to just start speaking, if you have an announcement or something come up that you want to share.
And also any last minute questions for Margaret, Mark Legg, or Mark Benthian, be a good time to throw those in the hopper as well.
Hi,
Hi,
this is
Carol.
Melissa.
Oh, Mary.
I have a question. So I'm working for Blind Developmental Disability Facility, and I have like a couple of like 5 or 6 apartments, about 11 residents. They are, they either use walkers, a bed bounding, or a wheelchair. My question is there anyone that will be able to come and train my staff and the residents proper way for preventing for earthquake for safety wise?
If you could put that request in an email to us at info@earthquakecountry.org, we will definitely coordinate what might be possible there, and from the general information to have some people who are really expert in this area. Thank you. We'd love to help support that. Carol. See your hand raised.
Thank you, Mark, and to everyone. Great presentations today. Just wanted to ask a general question. As we continue to see the devastation in Turkey and Syria, is there anything new or different that you want to tell us as we continue to cultivate preparedness and try to get out important messaging? For us here in the Los Angeles area, our work continues. It seems like it's never done, but seeing that devastation is just a reminder of how important it is. Although our infrastructure is different here, there's still a message for us. So just wanted to get some quick feedback on that, please.
Carol, that's a great point. And one thing too that we can that the scientific community has really been noticing here, or really observing, is that these faults and the earthquakes that have happened in Turkey are very similar to what we have here in California. And the pattern of having a 7.8, 6.7 aftershock, the size of Northridge, very soon after, and then a 7.5 kind of on an adjacent fault. That's all very similar to what can really happen here, in the same unexpected way as it happened in Turkey, meaning we won't know it's coming. There's a lot of work being done to understand how earthquakes can trigger other earthquakes, how the overall California San Andreas fault system interacts, all the faults that are offshore, the faults that are onshore, the plate boundary is just one crack. It's like you get that crack in your windshield and all the other ones start to splay off of it, and that's what we basically have. And so the lesson is, yes, we can have these types of earthquakes, and not only just the one, but the sequence of very large earthquakes. They've just had another, I think 6.3 this weekend, and it can keep happening. And are we ready for that type of environment? We plan for the big one, and then we're going to respond, and we kind of expect that the environment will allow us to do so. But that continued loss and continued damage. You're right. Our infrastructure, our buildings, generally built much better than in Turkey. We hope that the inspection process and all I hear was much more rigorous than happens in other places around the world. But we know that we will have losses. The shakeout scenario from 2008 describes the possibility of losses and injuries and deaths. That's far less than what we would have, what has happened in Turkey. But that again was really just the main shock, and there can be other earthquakes, and depending on where this all happens, if that big earthquake happens on the San Andreas, or as we know can happen even right under Los Angeles, the more populated area, the losses may even be higher. So we just have to keep doing what we're doing, getting prepared, and really supporting efforts to make sure our buildings are retrofitted, even though it's very costly, and doing what we can as individuals too. Any other comments, questions, or add-ons?
There was a question that I saw about finding information on the abilities Expo, and I put something in the chat on that. It's
And
not
the
a
link to the website there has been added as well.
Yeah, it's not a conference as much as it is an opportunity to understand more about the adaptive equipment that's available, the different kinds of things, the abilities of people with disabilities, and the organizations and a lot of the organizations that help support them. It's probably the single most concentrated opportunity to really get a picture of what's available to the disability community and what we can do to support it.
As
Yeah,
we come
and
up on the end here, Margaret, go ahead.
I also saw a request for the tsunami training website for the sign on for registration for that. I don't know if Ken Kondo is still on the line.
We also mentioned it's on the earthquakecountry.org/calendar page.
Okay,
link from
great.
there.
Yeah.
And you put the link into the chat, so
Yeah, I put the link. I hope
that's
that was
great.
right.
Thank you.
Uh-huh.
As we end here, just as it's coming on noon, think about what we have on the slide here, and please do share the information with others. We could, if you want to type something into the chat, you could do that. I do see a note, Carrie, I assume you're talking about the tsunami training. You're saying the registration's full, that there's a wait list. Yes, and he's replied yes. So Ken, is that, we just promoted it, but what's the likelihood of that opening up or wait list? You're able to comment? You see you're online. All right, so there is a wait list, so join that. Maybe at some point that course will be offered again. Margaret, Heidi, and Alan, any final comments before we end?
No, just reminding everybody to mark their calendars for our next meeting, which will be in May.
May 10th?
May
I
10th.
believe.
That's right, 10 o'clock, May 10th. Mark your calendars. We look forward to seeing everybody again.